March 1964, Seward, Alaska. 23 Caterpillar D8s are sitting stranded on a Pacific beach beside a port the sea has just torn apart. These were the machines brought in to clear the disaster. Instead, the shoreline kept them. To understand why 23 Caterpillar D8s ended up stranded on a Pacific beach at Seward, Alaska, you have to go back to the harbor before the water came in. In early 1964, Seward was one of the most important transportation points on the Gulf of Alaska. It was not large by American port standards, but it did not need to be. Its value came from position. The Alaska Railroad terminated there. Fuel, freight, machinery, and military cargo moved through its docks. Rail cars met ships. Warehouses sat close to the waterfront. Petroleum tanks stood above the port. The shoreline was not just a beach. It was working ground. Built up, filled, cut, and used hard. That mattered, because Seward's waterfront was never truly stable in the way it looked from above. Much of the developed harbor edge rested on man-made fill placed over young, water-saturated sediments. On paper, that ground could support roads, tracks, warehouses, cranes, and heavy cargo handling. Under ordinary loading, it did. But ordinary loading was not what arrived on the evening of March 27, 1964. The earthquake struck at 5:36 p.m. local time. Its magnitude was 9.2. The most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North American history. Across south-central Alaska, the shaking went on with a duration that survivors described not in seconds but in stages. In Seward, the ground did not simply tremble, it failed in sections. Rail yards twisted, dock structures broke loose, fuel tanks ruptured, fires started, and along the waterfront, the land itself began to move toward the sea. Mechanically, the problem was this: saturated fill and loose marine sediments can lose strength under prolonged shaking. When that happens, the surface may still look like ground for a moment, but it is no longer behaving like ground. It becomes a moving mass. Support disappears unevenly. Slabs crack. Track alignment vanishes. Bulkheads let go. In a port built on reclaimed edges and loaded working surfaces, that kind of failure is catastrophic. Seward got exactly that. Sections of the harbor dropped away or slumped into Resurrection Bay. Docks were wrecked. Rail facilities were damaged or destroyed. Cargo was thrown into the water or buried under broken timber, steel, and mud. Oil and fuel fed fires along the waterfront. Then came the waves. Not one clean wall of water in the simplified way later retellings often describe it, but a sequence of tsunami surges and seiche-like oscillations driven by the earthquake and by submarine slope failures in the bay. Water ran into the destroyed port, then pulled back through it, carrying wreckage, rail material, pilings, vehicles, and pieces of buildings. By the time the worst of it passed, Seward's shoreline had become something else entirely. The harbor was no longer a functioning port. It was a broken industrial margin of mud, debris, fire damage, collapsed fill, and unstable ground. The Alaska Railroad needed access restored. The town needed wreckage cleared. The shoreline had to be opened, sorted, and made passable before any real reconstruction could begin. That kind of work required weight, traction, and blade capacity. It required crawler tractors. The Caterpillar D8 was exactly the class of machine crews turned to for work like this. In the early 1960s, a D8 was not a delicate grading tractor. It was a heavy crawler built for pushing through resistance that stopped smaller machines cold. Depending on configuration, these machines weighed roughly 40 tons or more, with enough drawbar pull and blade capacity to move timber tangles, rail debris, saturated fill, and burned structural remains. On stable ground, a D8 could open a route where nothing on tires had a chance. On stable ground, that distinction would decide everything. In the days after the earthquake, heavy equipment began arriving for cleanup and emergency recovery. Among the most striking concentrations were the Caterpillar D8s brought into the Seward area to work the waterfront and adjacent wreckage fields. Some came with contractors. Some were moved in through emergency coordination. What matters is the scale. 23 D8s would eventually be counted stranded along the beach, a line of heavy tractors left facing a shoreline that had already defeated the port behind them. To understand how that happened, you have to understand the conditions those machines entered. This was not a normal debris yard. The beach and waterfront zone at Seward after the tsunami were layered with unstable material. Beneath the visible surface lay saturated sand, disturbed fill, buried wreckage, voids left by erosion, and sections where the earthquake had already reduced bearing strength before the water finished the job. A crawler tractor spreads its weight better than a wheeled machine, but it does not float. A D8 survives by distributing load through track area onto ground that still has enough shear strength to resist it. If the material below has turned fluid, undermined, or hollow, the machine's size becomes a liability. On paper, the D8s could do the job. On the beach, conditions changed everything. Crews were trying to clear access, push drifted wreckage, sort shoreline debris, and support rail and port recovery operations in an environment where the exact edge of safe ground was often invisible. The water had rearranged the shoreline. Former working surfaces were gone. New bars, troughs, and soft zones had formed where no operator would have expected them from pre-quake maps or memory. What looked compact at low tide could open under load. What looked dry on the surface could be saturated below. And the beach itself was not empty. It was cluttered with timber, steel, cable, broken dock sections, and flood-thrown debris that hid the ground behavior underneath. That is the kind of site where a heavy crawler can work for an hour without incident and then lose the margin all at once. Some of the D8s were used close to the waterline because that was where the wreckage was heaviest and where access had to be forced first. The machines pushed drift piles, pulled material clear of rail approaches, and tried to impose order on a shoreline that had been physically remade in minutes. But every pass carried risk. Saltwater had saturated the substrate. Tsunami withdrawal had scoured some sections and buried others. In places, the beach was less a surface than a skin over disturbed material. The machine was fighting physics, not just workload, and there was another constraint. Seward could not wait for perfect geotechnical understanding. This was emergency cleanup. Rail connection mattered. Harbor access mattered. Fire damage, fuel contamination, and debris congestion mattered. Operators and supervisors were making field decisions under pressure, with incomplete information, on a coast still settling from one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. That is how 23 Caterpillar D8s reached the beach. They were brought in because few other machines in America could do what Seward needed done in those first recovery days. But the same qualities that made them indispensable — weight, traction, blade force, and willingness to go where wheeled equipment could not — also carried them onto ground that had not finished failing. By the time the shoreline revealed that fact, several of those machines were already committed too far forward to leave easily. Then the margin disappeared along Seward's damaged waterfront. The work had started as clearance. Push the driftwood back. Open a path. Drag twisted rail clear of the approach. Cut through the broken line where dock timber, fuel-soaked debris, and earthquake-thrown mud had fused into something closer to a barricade than a shoreline. For a time, the D8s could still do what they had been brought there to do. Their blades bit into wreckage. Their tracks held. The beach looked ugly, unstable, and temporary, but still usable. Then operators began to find the places where the surface was lying. A crawler tractor does not usually fail with drama first. It gives warning through feel. One track settles a little deeper than the other. The machine begins to labor without advancing. The blade loads differently. The ground under the seat no longer feels firm but delayed, almost elastic. On a normal job, that is the moment to back out, change angle, reassess the pass. On a post-tsunami beach layered with fill, tidal saturation, buried timber, and voids, that moment could come too late. By the time the operator felt the change, tens of tons of steel were already committed to material that no longer had the strength to carry it. Some machines bogged at the edge of the work zone and were pulled free. Others went farther in, where the shoreline had been reworked by the surge and by the drawdown that followed. The problem was not simply mud. Mechanically, mud is often recoverable if there is enough bearing strength beneath it. What trapped the D8s was a combination of soft, saturated cover over disturbed sublayers, hidden debris mats, and sections of beach where scouring had removed support from below. The track spread the load, but once the crust broke, the tractors began pressing into material that displaced instead of resisting. That should have remained a recovery problem. It became a parking line. As more machines were brought into the same damaged zone, the beach itself started dictating where they could and could not go. A dozer that tried to rescue another dozer risked entering the same failed ground. Cable pulls required anchors, and anchor machines needed reliable footing. In several places, there was none. A 40-ton crawler on unstable beach is not just heavy, it is heavy in a way that compounds the failure. Every additional pass churns the surface, pumps water upward, breaks buried timber rafts, and widens the area of disturbed ground. At that point, the operation changed. The priority was no longer forcing every stranded machine back out immediately. It was keeping crews alive, salvaging what could be moved safely, and preventing the recovery effort from consuming more equipment than it saved. Some D8s were repositioned above the softest sections and left idle. Others sat lower, closer to the tide line, because moving them in worsening conditions would have required another commitment into the same unstable belt that had already trapped the first tractors. The machines were still intact. Many were still mechanically serviceable, but the beach under them was not trustworthy enough to justify repeated extraction attempts under emergency conditions. So the line of stranded tractors became one of the strangest industrial images left by the Alaska earthquake. Heavy Caterpillar D8s sitting nose to tail along a ruined shore, not destroyed in the dramatic sense, but pinned by ground that had lost the ability to behave like ground. The machine was not weak. The site was. That distinction matters because later retellings often flatten these events into a simpler idea. The dozers got stuck in the mud. Seward was worse than that. The earthquake had already destabilized the waterfront through settlement and lateral spreading. The tsunami and harbor surges had then scoured, saturated, buried, and rearranged the shoreline. What the D8s were working on was not a normal beach and not a normal port surface. It was a temporary skin over a damaged coastal structure. Under one machine pass it might hold. Under the next it might shear, liquefy, or collapse into a void hidden by debris. That is why the count matters. Not one D8, not two, 23. A single lost machine can be written off as operator error, bad luck, or one poor decision. A stranded line of 23 heavy crawlers says something else. It says the conditions were larger than any single operator and larger than any one pass plan. It says the recovery zone itself had become deceptive enough to defeat the very machines chosen because they were supposed to dominate difficult ground. In the immediate aftermath, Seward still needed to be rebuilt. Rail service had to be restored. The harbor had to be reestablished. Burned and broken sections of the waterfront had to be cleared, stabilized, and redesigned around what the earthquake had exposed. Some of the stranded D8s were eventually recovered, relocated, or broken out as site conditions improved and more organized reconstruction replaced the first emergency push. Others remained in place long enough to become part of the visual record of the disaster. Machines at rest on a beach they had gone there to conquer. The reason those images endure is not just scale, it is contradiction. A Caterpillar D8 is supposed to be the machine you send when the lighter equipment has no chance. It is the answer to resistance. It is the machine for timber tangles, saturated fill, broken approaches, and brute force clearance. At Seward, those same strengths carried the tractors into a zone where power was no longer the deciding factor. Bearing failure was. Subsurface instability was. Hidden scour and waterlogged fill were. The D8s did not run out of horsepower. They ran out of ground. And Seward itself forced that lesson hard. The 1964 Alaska earthquake killed 131 people across the region. Entire communities were damaged or erased. Ports, roads, rail lines, and fuel facilities were broken in minutes. In Seward, the combination of earthquake damage, submarine slides, fire, and tsunami impact turned a working transportation hub into a wrecked industrial shoreline that had to be relearned before it could be rebuilt. The stranded dozers were part of that relearning. They marked, in steel, the boundary between what emergency crews thought the coast still was and what it had actually become. The site is quieter now. The port was rebuilt. Rail operations returned. Modern visitors can stand in Seward and see a functioning harbor where the 1964 shoreline once failed. But the record remains in photographs, reports, and the memory of those first cleanup days when the beach filled with machines too heavy to trust and too necessary to do without. What survived was not just the equipment, but the lesson behind it. On paper, the D8s were the right machines. In the field, no machine specification could cancel a waterfront that had lost its internal structure. That is why Seward still matters. It is a machine story, but not one about mechanical weakness. It is a story about terrain after catastrophe, about the false confidence of surfaces, and about the moment when some of the strongest crawler tractors in American service met ground that had already stopped being land. The dozers are gone from that beach now. The consequence is not. If you appreciate machine history told at ground level, subscribe for more stories like this. And if you have worked coastal fill, port cleanup, or unstable saturated ground, tell us what stands out to you here, because Seward was not the last time heavy crawlers learned this lesson. Years later, in Alaska again, another big caterpillar would meet ground that looked solid until the weight came onto it